Bay of Manila, February 1944, and the jungle pressed heavy against the night. A column of Japanese infantry, barefoot on the damp earth, crept silently through the blackness. For years, darkness had been their ally, trained to move without light, to strike when the enemy could neither see nor organize. They believed this hour before dawn was theirs. The whispers of officers carried the old confidence. Americans were blind at night, easy prey for the bayonet. Yet the night was not silent. Somewhere ahead, deep in the shadows, a different kind of watch was waiting. Hidden among the trees, American soldiers lay in ambush with weapons that gleamed faintly under cloth covers. Strange attachments fixed to the barrels of their carbines. They had drilled for weeks with this new device, stumbling at first, then learning that what once seemed impossible was now reality. To see through total darkness as though it were dawn. At 70 yards, the shapes of the advancing Japanese appeared in green silhouettes, every movement crisp and unmistakable. What had once been a terrifying rush of invisible figures was now a pattern of targets revealed in detail. The American gunners did not shout, did not fire blindly. They waited until the line of infantry entered the zone, calm in the knowledge that every trigger pull would find its mark. The Japanese pressed forward, unaware that their footsteps, once a herald of fear, were now the sound of men walking into a trap. They carried rifles and grenades, blades sharpened for the rush that had broken so many defenses on so many islands. But this night was different. The jungle that had always cloaked them no longer offered safety. It was as though the forest itself had betrayed them. Then came the first shot. A crack of a carbine, sharp and final, echoed through the trees. A figure fell in mid-stride, never knowing what had struck him. Before the second man could cry out, another round cut him down. The line hesitated, confusion spreading like fire through dry leaves. Still the Americans did not reveal themselves, their fire measured, precise, coming from nowhere and everywhere at once. For the Japanese soldiers, the night had turned. Darkness, their trusted weapon, now swallowed them whole. Each step forward was a step into the unknown, into a battlefield where they no longer held the advantage. What they could not see was the future of warfare glowing quietly in American hands, an invention they could never have imagined, a lens that transformed night into day and rendered their tactics obsolete in a single, brutal moment. The first seconds of firing tore the silence apart, but what followed was worse. Instead of wild chaos, instead of the deafening storm of machine guns and grenades the Japanese expected from a panicked American line, the shots came steady, deliberate, each round finding a target with unnatural certainty. Men collapsed in the dark without ever glimpsing the enemy. Officers barked orders, urging their troops to charge, but every attempt to rally dissolved into sudden screams as invisible bullets cut through the ranks. To the Japanese infantrymen, it felt like being hunted by ghosts. Their doctrine had promised that night would blind the enemy, that courage and momentum would overwhelm confused defenders. Instead, the Americans fired with uncanny precision, striking leaders first, then machine gun crews, then the men holding grenades. It was as if the enemy had eyes in the darkness, as if their positions were marked before a single step had been taken. Those few who pushed forward tried to fire into the jungle at random, hoping to silence the hidden guns, but their bullets found only trees and empty shadows. The Americans remained unseen, their carbines speaking from blackness with merciless calm. For the first time in countless island battles, the Japanese discovered that night, once their greatest ally, had turned against them. On the American side, tension gave way to grim confidence. Weeks of secret drills now paid off. Each soldier peered through the heavy glass tubes fixed above his weapon, green light shimmering across the jungle. What their fathers had never dreamed of in the trenches of 1918, they now held in their hands. The ability to fight, as though the sun still burned in the sky. Officers whispered commands, not shouted, because there was no need for panic. They could see everything. At 70 yards, every silhouette glowed with clarity. The enemy stumbled, shouted, tried to disappear into the undergrowth, but the jungle no longer hid them. The Americans fired calmly, marking targets the way hunters mark game. One man later recalled the eerie certainty. They weren't charging us. They were walking straight into a shooting gallery. For the Japanese, disbelief gave way to dread. The dark had always promised safety, but now it felt like a trap. Somewhere in the jungle, unseen eyes watched every move, and every flash of gunfire from their side only revealed new targets. Darkness had betrayed them, and the night they had trusted for so long now belonged to someone else. The momentum of the attack dissolved within minutes. What had begun as a confident advance turned into confusion, then panic. Small groups of Japanese soldiers broke off and rushed blindly toward the sound of gunfire, hoping to close the distance with bayonet and grenade. It was the tactic that had shattered defenses from Malaya to the Philippines. But this night was not like those nights. Each charge collapsed before it reached 20 paces. The unseen Americans cut them down with single shots, the green glow in their scopes turning the battlefield into a series of clean, calculated executions. Officers tried to regain control, shouting for their men to regroup, to flank, to push harder. Yet every time a voice rose above the din, it was silenced by a precise crack of a carbine. Leaders fell first, leaving their units stumbling in the dark without direction. Survivors huddled against trees or pressed themselves into the mud, waiting for the blinding counterattack that never came. The Americans did not reveal themselves, did not rush forward with bayonets or flood the jungle with flares. They simply watched and waited, pulling triggers only when movement appeared in the eerie glow of their sights. The Japanese doctrine of night combat had always rested on two principles: shock and invisibility. By the time the enemy understood what was happening, it was supposed to be too late. But now the opposite was true. The shock belonged to the defenders. The invisibility had vanished. Instead of ambushing, the Japanese were ambushed. Instead of hunting, they were hunted. One infantryman, captured later and questioned by Allied intelligence, admitted with hollow eyes, "We were firing at ghosts. We never saw them. Every bullet went into shadows. He was not alone." Dozens of survivors repeated the same thing. They had charged into a void, their senses useless, their courage met by a power beyond their understanding. Behind the American line, commanders noted the transformation with quiet satisfaction. For years, the Japanese had dominated the darkness. Their troops were trained to move by moonlight, to read the ground by touch, to use silence as a weapon. But now, the battlefield had shifted. The new carbines had stripped that advantage away in a single night. Where once the Japanese had relied on fear and confusion, now they faced calm precision. The jungle echoed, not with the clash of bayonets, but with measured gunfire, and the cries of men who realized too late that the night no longer belonged to them. By dawn, the battlefield lay scattered with bodies, silent, except for the faint groans of the wounded. Smoke from abandoned grenades drifted low over the jungle floor, mixing with the morning mist. The Japanese assault force, once so confident in the darkness, had been reduced to fragments. Their officers were gone, their formation shattered. What survivors remained slipped back into the trees, broken and disoriented, unable to understand what had destroyed them. In their minds, the night had always been the surest ally. They trained for years to move silently, to strike without warning, to use the cloak of blackness as a shield stronger than steel. Yet this battle revealed that the night was no longer theirs. Darkness had turned traitor, exposing them instead of hiding them. The suddenness of this reversal struck deeper than bullets. It dismantled an entire doctrine. American reports later described the engagement as almost effortless. Ammunition expenditure was minimal compared to daylight battles. Casualties were nearly non-existent. Soldiers wrote in their journals that the new technology gave them an eerie sense of control, as if the battlefield were tilted permanently in their favor. One corporal wrote, "They came to kill us in the dark, but we were the ones who owned the night." For the Japanese high command, news of this defeat was more disturbing than the loss itself. Until that night, their infantry units had relied on the same tactic again and again. The sudden rush at midnight, the scream of the banzai charge, the certainty that the enemy would fire wildly into the void. Now, those tactics had turned into suicide. Attacks that once promised glory ended only in slaughter. Intelligence officers tried to make sense of it. Reports spoke of strange optics, of Americans who could see without moonlight. Some claimed it was witchcraft, others swore it was trickery with hidden flares, but the evidence was undeniable. Survivors described how every movement, even the twitch of a hand, drew immediate fire. The enemy saw them when no one should have. In that single engagement, the balance of power at night shifted permanently. The Japanese, masters of the midnight battlefield, were forced into daylight fighting, where American firepower and logistics already held the advantage. What they could not know was that this was only the beginning, that the device in American hands was not a single trick, but a revolution, the weapon of the future they could never have imagined. The weeks that followed brought whispers through every Japanese regiment stationed in the Pacific. Men who had once boasted of their prowess in night fighting now lowered their voices when darkness fell. Patrols moved hesitantly, their officers uneasy. The jungle paths that once seemed safe havens for infiltration now felt like corridors of death. In diaries recovered after the war, Japanese soldiers wrote the same haunting thought again and again. The Americans can see us at night. What none of them knew was how the weapon truly worked. Mounted on the barrel of an M1 carbine was a heavy box-like sight, its heart powered by a backpack battery that hummed faintly in the stillness. Through this device, the black jungle transformed into an eerie green world. Shapes glowed where human eyes saw nothing. Every tree etched in phantom outlines, every movement of a man rendered as a silhouette against the night. The technology was fragile, temperamental, and required constant care. Soldiers had to protect its glass lens from fog, its power source from rain, its wires from snapping under the strain of jungle marches. But when it functioned, it overturned centuries of combat. For the first time in history, men could aim and fire in total darkness, as if the sun were rising over the battlefield. The Americans who carried these strange carbines trained relentlessly to use them. They learned to pace their shots, to conserve the 20-round magazines for moments when enemy figures crossed open ground. They practiced moving silently, because the glow of the sight worked both ways. It revealed the enemy, but any careless noise still gave away position. They were told that secrecy mattered more than victory. The Japanese must not learn too soon that a new age of warfare had begun. On the receiving end, the shock grew unbearable. Japanese doctrine had taught that courage and speed would overwhelm any defender, that the bayonet charge was unstoppable once unleashed. Yet in battle after battle, men were cut down long before they reached striking distance. Entire companies disappeared into the blackness, leaving only scattered rifles and the echo of their own battle cries. One survivor, later captured and interrogated, described the experience in trembling detail. "We thought the jungle would protect us. We thought they were blind, but they fired as if it were daylight. We were like children running at shadows." His words captured the new truth. The night, once the Empire's chosen weapon, had been stolen from them. It now belonged to those strange carbines glowing with green fire. By the spring of 1944, the change was unmistakable. American patrols that once dreaded dusk now welcomed it. Units equipped with the new carbines volunteered for missions that would have been considered suicide only months before. Jungle outposts could be held with fewer men, for every rifle equipped with the strange glowing sight was worth a squad in the dark. Reports filtered back to headquarters, describing engagements where 20 Americans repelled hundreds of attackers, firing with calm precision while their enemies stumbled blindly into the killing ground. For the Japanese command, each failed assault brought mounting frustration. Night attacks had been the pride of the Imperial Army, drilled into recruits from their first weeks of training. Officers reminded their men that courage after sunset was the equalizer against American firepower. But as casualties rose, confidence waned. Veterans who had once trusted the night now spoke in hushed tones about the death carbines. Whispers spread of demons in the jungle, of enemies who could see through leaves and shadow. Technical explanations were absent. Most soldiers did not know what had changed. They only knew that every attempt to approach silently ended the same way. A sudden crack of rifles in the dark, comrades falling before they ever fired a shot. Some units tried to adapt by spreading out, crawling slowly, or waiting for rain to mask their advance. Yet even in storms, the Americans seemed to find them. The Americans, meanwhile, treated the new devices as the most guarded of secrets. Manuals were locked away. Soldiers were warned never to let the equipment be captured. When one was damaged beyond repair, it was destroyed with grenades rather than risk falling into enemy hands. Commanders emphasized that this was not merely a weapon, but a revolution. If the Japanese ever understood how it worked, they might copy it, and the balance would shift again. Night after night, the pattern repeated. The Japanese attacked with shouts and courage, expecting confusion and fear. Instead, they met silence, followed by precise fire. Bayonets never reached their mark. Grenades never found their targets. Every charge collapsed under invisible eyes that guided bullets with impossible accuracy. By the time word reached Tokyo, the shock was absolute. Reports from multiple islands told the same story. American defenders no longer feared the dark. They welcomed it. For the first time since the outbreak of the Pacific War, Japanese commanders faced the unthinkable truth that the Empire's greatest advantage had turned into its most dangerous weakness. In the dim corridors of Japanese headquarters, disbelief hardened into dread. Commanders gathered around maps, red pins marking assaults that had collapsed in darkness. The pattern was undeniable. The very hours they had once chosen for decisive strikes were now delivering catastrophe. At staff briefings, younger officers hesitated to speak, afraid to admit the obvious, that American technology had stripped away their greatest advantage. Eyewitness reports from survivors circulated like rumors of ghosts. Soldiers swore that the enemy fired without flares, without searchlights, without any sign of illumination. Men advancing silently through bamboo groves were picked off one by one, as though followed by unseen eyes. "It was not war," one officer confessed bitterly in his diary, later captured by Allied forces. "It was slaughter in the dark." Some commanders proposed abandoning night attacks altogether. Others clung to tradition, insisting that courage could still prevail if units attacked in larger numbers. Yet each new attempt ended the same way. The charge collapsed before it reached shouting distance. Brave men cut down by enemies who never revealed themselves. Ammunition was wasted on empty shadows. Rifles cracked into nothingness, and every volley only drew more precise fire from the Americans. Across the ocean, Allied analysts studied captured Japanese communications with quiet satisfaction. They knew the secrecy of the device was holding. The Japanese had no technical explanation, only fear. Reports spoke of unholy optics, of Americans who possessed the eyes of tigers at night. It was a psychological blow, as devastating as the bullets themselves. The empire that had prided itself on discipline and courage was now haunted by an invisible power it could not match. American soldiers sensed the shift as well. Morale climbed with each engagement. Men who once dreaded the approach of night began to trust it, confident that their carbines gave them a decisive edge. It was like being handed daylight, one sergeant later recalled. They came at us screaming, but we could see every one of them. They never had a chance. For the Japanese infantry, the jungle had turned traitor. Darkness, once a faithful shield, now betrayed them with every step. The unseen device mounted to American carbines had rewritten the rules of war, and in doing so, it shattered the very doctrine on which the empire had built its confidence. On the front lines, the shift was felt not only in outcomes, but in the minds of the men who fought. Japanese infantry had been raised on the certainty that night turned the battlefield in their favor. Young recruits were told legends of past victories, where darkness gave courage the edge over firepower. But now, as fresh units arrived from the homeland, they were met not with triumph, but with silence from veterans. The old stories no longer inspired. Those who had survived recent battles spoke only of unseen fire and comrades falling without warning. American reports noted the change in behavior. Patrols that once pressed forward aggressively now hesitated at dusk. Enemy scouts who used to crawl fearlessly toward outposts stopped short, listening, waiting, as though they feared the jungle itself was watching them. The few who advanced were quickly silenced by accurate shots from the carbines, their positions revealed through glowing lenses that stripped the shadows bare. Among the American ranks, the new weapon became both tool and talisman. Training had taught them to trust the heavy battery packs, to cradle the fragile optics even in pouring rain, to check the humming wires before every patrol. The sight's eerie green glow became a familiar companion, its viewfinder transforming terror into clarity. For men who had once fired blindly into darkness, the ability to see an approaching enemy at 70 yards felt like nothing less than a miracle. Japanese prisoners spoke of the effect with bitter awe. One admitted that entire platoons fired hundreds of rounds without ever seeing a target. Another said their commanders believed the Americans had trained wild animals to track them in the dark. Such rumors revealed the growing sense of helplessness. Fear spread faster than facts, and the unknown power behind the carbines magnified the panic with each failed assault. In Tokyo, reports arrived in fragments, often censored by embarrassed officers unwilling to explain why elite night fighters had been destroyed. High command debated whether the Americans had developed a new kind of flare, a chemical that glowed without light, or even aircraft circling invisibly above. None of the theories matched the eyewitness accounts. The truth, that the enemy now carried the future in their hands, remained unthinkable. On the islands, however, the truth was inescapable. Every jungle path, every night raid, every stealthy approach once promised victory. Now, they promised only death. Darkness had turned into a deadly trap, and the Japanese soldiers could feel the weight of it pressing in with every setting sun. By midsummer, the consequences reached every corner of the Pacific campaign. American outposts, once considered vulnerable after dusk, now stood firm against repeated assaults. Reports from island garrisons spoke of battles fought almost entirely in the dark, where dozens of attackers fell without a single defender lost. Commanders noted with astonishment that night raids, once the most feared tactic of the Imperial Army, had become invitations to disaster. In the field, the shift was visible in the eyes of the men. Japanese infantry, who once advanced with shouts and bayonets, now crept hesitantly, unsure if they were walking into invisible crosshairs. The old thunder of banzai charges dwindled to scattered attempts, broken before they could gain momentum. "We no longer believed in victory at night," one survivor admitted years later. "Every step forward felt like suicide." American soldiers, though hardened by months of fighting, could not ignore the strange power they carried. They spoke of how the jungle looked transformed through the new lenses, each leaf outlined, each movement betrayed. At 70 yards, the enemy seemed close enough to touch, outlined in spectral green. Some wrote home that it felt almost unfair, as though the enemy were children stumbling into a trap. Yet others reminded themselves that fairness had no place in war. The technology remained cloaked in secrecy. Devices were given only to select units, guarded by strict orders. Manuals were burned after training, and no photographs were allowed. Even among the troops, rumors spread that the equipment came from another world, that scientists had unlocked forces beyond human sight. To the enemy, the mystery was even greater. Captured diaries revealed men convinced that the Americans had eyes like animals, glowing in the night. Strategists in Washington understood the deeper significance. This was more than a battlefield advantage. It was a weapon that unraveled the very fabric of Japanese doctrine. Night had been their chosen ground, their chance to offset American artillery and air power. With that ground stripped away, they were forced into daylight battles where they could not compete. The balance of the war shifted not only in numbers and supply, but in the hearts of the men who fought. Each new engagement confirmed the lesson. Darkness no longer shielded the attacker. It betrayed him, exposing his movements to weapons he could not comprehend. What had once been the Empire's greatest strength now became its most dangerous weakness, and the jungle nights of 1944 whispered of an old truth reborn. The future of war belonged to those who could see when others could not. On the ridges above Saipan, the shift became undeniable. Japanese commanders, desperate to break the American line, launched night assaults with entire battalions. The plan mirrored countless earlier victories, overwhelmed tired defenders with speed, courage, and the chaos of darkness. But what unfolded was not battle. It was annihilation. Columns advancing through the cane fields were cut down before they even closed half the distance. Rifle fire came precise and steady, never blind, never panicked. By dawn, the fields were littered with fallen soldiers who had never seen the enemy's faces. American after-action reports spoke with a tone of quiet disbelief. Companies equipped with the new carbines had held off attacks 5 times their size with minimal losses. Officers noted how calm their men remained, firing slowly, deliberately, watching each figure through the strange glowing lenses until it fell. "It felt less like a firefight," one lieutenant recorded, "and more like target practice at night." For the Japanese survivors, the experience was shattering. They described shouting orders into the dark, only to have the voices silenced by single shots. Machine gun crews, once the spearhead of night attacks, were destroyed before they could even set up their weapons. One captured sergeant admitted that his men fired hundreds of rounds into empty space, praying to hit something, anything. Instead, they heard the sound of bullets snapping from unseen rifles, each shot finding its mark. High command in Tokyo struggled to explain the defeats. Intelligence officers gathered reports that spoke of a new American device, something mounted on rifles, powered by batteries, able to pierce the night itself. Some dismissed it as rumor. Others feared it was true. Still, no orders came to abandon night tactics. Tradition and pride bound the doctrine too tightly. Attacks continued, and each one bled away more of Japan's finest troops. Meanwhile, American soldiers embraced their advantage with growing confidence. Patrols pushed deeper into the jungle at dusk, secure in the knowledge that their eyes could see what the enemy could not. Ambushes once feared became opportunities. The balance of terror had shifted. Now it was the Japanese who whispered of ghosts, who dreaded the sound of twigs breaking in the night, who wondered how long before unseen eyes marked them for death. The Pacific War was still far from over, but the myth of Japanese invincibility after dark had been broken. A single technology, fragile and secret, had stripped the empire of the weapon it trusted most. From Saipan onward, the night belonged to someone else. On the island of Leyte, the pattern reached its grim climax. Japanese infantry, ordered to mount yet another midnight assault, moved forward with the same discipline and silence drilled into them for years. But every squad leader knew, deep in his gut, that the night no longer offered hope. The men advanced because orders demanded it, not because they believed in success. When the first shots cracked through the dark, cutting down the point men before they could even raise their rifles, the rest understood. They were walking into certain death. American positions, hidden among palm groves and ridgelines, lit up with controlled bursts. Each rifleman peered through the pale green glow of his sight, selecting targets calmly as if on a training range. Machine guns, once the centerpiece of defensive fire, played only a supporting role. It was the carbines that dominated the night, their operators whispering target directions to each other, adjusting fire with steady confidence. Japanese soldiers tried to adapt. Some crawled low, hoping to vanish into the grass. Others rushed forward, bayonets fixed, praying that sheer speed would close the distance. But the glowing optics betrayed them all. At 70 yards they appeared clearly, each desperate movement outlined in the phantom light. The Americans fired with surgical precision. A charge that once would have struck terror now ended in silence, the attackers falling one by one before they reached the wire. Captured diaries later revealed the despair these battles created. One lieutenant wrote that his men were chasing phantoms with empty rifles. Another recorded the bitter truth. Every time we moved, they saw us. Every time we fired, they killed us. It was like fighting gods. Such testimonies carried back to Tokyo, where senior officers began to question whether night fighting could continue at all. For the Americans, the experience reshaped their entire view of warfare. The fear of dusk was gone. Where once men had tightened their grips on rifles as the sun sank, now they welcomed the dark. They knew that the jungle, the ridges, the rivers, all the places the enemy had ruled, were now under their watchful eyes. One sergeant later said simply, "We took back the night." By the end of 1944, the Japanese command could no longer ignore the truth. Their greatest weapon, the tactic that had carried them across Asia and the Pacific, had collapsed. Night attacks no longer meant glory or surprise. They meant only slaughter. The Empire's faith in darkness was gone, and with it went a crucial part of their fighting spirit. The collapse of Japan's night doctrine was felt far beyond the battlefield. In the villages of the home islands, where propaganda had long celebrated the unstoppable Banzai charge under the moon, whispers of failure crept into the letters returned from the front. Families read words they could scarcely believe, that their sons had attacked bravely in darkness, only to be cut down by enemies who somehow saw every step. The myth of nocturnal supremacy, once a pillar of morale, began to fracture. At the same time, American commanders recognized the psychological force of their new advantage. They did not need to fight every night to win. The fear itself did much of the work. Patrols equipped with the glowing carbines moved deliberately through the jungle, sometimes firing only a few rounds, yet entire Japanese units would retreat, convinced they faced overwhelming numbers. Darkness became not a shield, but a trap, and the enemy walked into it night after night. Technicians guarded the devices with absolute secrecy. Each was issued only to selected men, who were drilled in how to carry the heavy batteries, how to shield the fragile optics from rain, how to strip and clean the weapon without exposing its secrets. If one sight failed, it was destroyed. If a soldier fell, comrades were ordered to recover or smash the equipment before the enemy could touch it. For decades afterward, veterans would remember the burden, not just the physical weight, but the knowledge that they carried the most closely guarded tool of the war. Japanese officers struggled to explain the defeats. Some claimed the Americans used hidden searchlights. Others spoke of balloons carrying invisible flares, and still others blamed cowardice among their own men. None of these explanations satisfied the survivors, who had looked into the void and felt its betrayal. They knew what their leaders could not admit. The enemy had eyes in the dark. On Guam, on Leyte, on countless unnamed ridges and beaches, the same story repeated. Charges dissolved before reaching the wire, ambushes collapsed under precise fire, and patrols returned bloodied from enemies they never saw. Courage remained, but courage without vision was powerless. By early 1945, the lesson was unshakable. The Empire's most cherished tactic had turned against itself. Where once the night had promised victory, it now whispered only of death. The Americans had seized not just the battlefield, but the very hours of darkness, rewriting the rules of war with a device so strange and so powerful that even decades later, it would remain cloaked in secrecy. In the ruins of Luzon, the transformation became undeniable. Night after night, Japanese battalions launched their desperate thrusts, hoping that sheer willpower could break the American perimeter. But every attack ended the same way. Steady carbine fire erupting from the darkness, each shot precise, each volley cutting down men before they reached grenade range. The jungle paths, once gateways to victory, became corridors of certain death. American war diaries captured the eerie calm of these engagements. Soldiers wrote of watching glowing silhouettes move across their sights, of firing single rounds, and watching enemy squads collapse as though swept by an invisible hand. It felt like we were hunting shadows, one private confessed. Except the shadows bled. For men hardened by years of combat, the strangeness of this power never fully faded. The Japanese could no longer deny the truth. Their most experienced officers admitted that night fighting was broken. Orders continued to come from Tokyo. Attack at dusk, overwhelm the defenders. But in the field, those orders felt like death warrants. Units marched, knowing they would not return. Survivors later recalled the emptiness in their comrades' eyes. Men who no longer believed in their mission, but obeyed simply because honor demanded it. Among the Americans, the technology remained wrapped in silence. Reports were stamped classified and filed away under strict lock. Even within the army, only a handful of commanders knew how the new sites worked or where they had come from. To the ordinary soldier, it was enough to know that they could see when the enemy could not. To the Japanese, it was enough to know that their doctrine had collapsed. By early 1945, whispers spread through every regiment of the Imperial Army. We cannot win in the dark. Soldiers who had once laughed at American fear of night now dreaded the fall of the sun. Patrols grew smaller, attacks fewer, and entire units sat frozen in the jungle, unwilling to advance into what they believed was a trap. The tide of war had already turned, but this change in spirit marked a deeper shift. Japan's warriors had lost more than men. They had lost faith in the very tactics that had defined their fighting style. The Empire had trusted the night. Now the night belonged to someone else. On Okinawa, the final proof came. The island's jagged ridges and tangled ravines offered perfect ground for night infiltration, the kind of terrain Japanese officers had always trusted. Under cover of darkness, they launched wave after wave of attacks, convinced that if any battlefield favored their doctrine, it was here. But the Americans were waiting. Through the green haze of their strange optics, they saw every shadow, every movement, every figure creeping through the brush. The results were catastrophic. Platoons advancing in silence suddenly erupted in screams as precise fire cut them down before they even closed half the distance. Grenadiers never reached their throwing range. Machine gun teams were silenced the moment they set up, and officers fell before their men knew what was happening. The fury of the banzai charge dissolved into chaos, bodies scattering in the dark as rifles cracked one after another with mechanical rhythm. American reports from Okinawa read less like accounts of desperate defense and more like records of methodical execution. Commanders noted the remarkable calm of their troops, who fired with confidence instead of panic. Soldiers no longer spoke of surviving the night. They spoke of owning it. "The darkness was ours," one Marine later said. "We could see them. They couldn't see us." It was as simple as that. For the Japanese high command, the psychological blow was devastating. Night had been more than a tactic. It had been an identity, a symbol of spirit and discipline. To lose it was to lose part of their warfighting soul. Reports described units refusing to attack after dusk, veterans whispering warnings to new recruits, officers struggling to enforce orders that no longer inspired obedience. Even as the empire collapsed under the weight of blockade and bombardment, this loss of faith carried its own heavy cost. Night raids had once balanced the scales against American firepower. Now they were nothing more than suicide missions. Courage alone could not bridge the gulf created by technology. By the spring of 1945, the verdict was final. Darkness no longer belonged to Japan. The empire's trusted weapon had been stripped away, replaced by fear of an enemy who could see in absolute blackness. And with that, the last pillar of their night-fighting tradition crumbled into dust. In the months after Okinawa, the truth spread quietly through the ranks of the defeated empire. Prisoners captured in the Philippines, on Iwo Jima, and finally in Okinawa, all spoke the same words. "We could not fight at night. We could not even see them." To Allied interrogators, these confessions revealed the depth of the shock. To the soldiers who had survived those battles, it was confirmation of what they already knew. Technology had turned the battlefield upside down. The weapon remained hidden from the world. American officers ordered it locked away in crates marked top secret. Photographs were forbidden, diagrams restricted, reports sealed with classification stamps that would remain untouched for decades. The men who carried the devices home were warned never to speak of them, told that silence was part of their duty. For many years after the war, the story of how the Japanese night attacks had collapsed remained half-whispered, buried under layers of secrecy. Yet among the veterans, memories endured. Some recalled the weight of the battery packs digging into their backs, the hum of wires in the damp air, the ghostly glow of the green images that revealed enemies slipping through the jungle. Others remembered the faces of comrades staring into the lenses, whispering in disbelief that they could see in pitch blackness. For them, the device was not just a weapon, but a doorway into the future. In Japan, the loss remained unexplained. Soldiers returned home with haunted eyes, their accounts confusing families who had been told that night fighting was the empire's supreme strength. Some spoke of demons, others of American sorcery, and still others of a science so far beyond their own that it seemed unreal. Whatever the cause, the conclusion was always the same. After that war, they no longer believed in victory at night. Historians would later call it a turning point, one of those quiet revolutions that rarely make headlines, yet decide the fate of armies. Darkness, once the most reliable ally of Japanese infantry, had been stripped away in a single campaign. And in that loss lay the deeper truth. Courage without vision is nothing. The empire's warriors had fought with bravery beyond measure, but bravery could not overcome what they could not even see. The battlefield had entered a new age, one in which technology, not tradition, decided who lived and who died when the sun went down. When the war finally ended, few outside select American units understood why Japanese night attacks had collapsed so completely. Official history spoke vaguely of improved defenses, of stronger discipline, of better training. The real story remained hidden in sealed files, because the technology that stripped the empire of its advantage was deemed too valuable to reveal. For decades, it was kept under lock, its very existence known only to engineers, intelligence officers, and the men who had carried it through the jungles. Those men aged in silence. Veterans who had once held the strange glowing carbines watched as books and films portrayed the war without mention of their secret. Some tried to explain to their families why they had never feared the dark, why night patrols had seemed less terrifying to them than to others. Most simply kept quiet, remembering the strict orders that had bound them in 1944. Yet in reunions, in letters, and in private diaries, they recorded the memory of watching the night unfold in shades of green, of seeing enemies who thought themselves invisible walk straight into their sights. For the Japanese, the silence cut differently. Survivors of the failed night charges lived with questions that no one answered. They had been told they were the masters of the dark, yet they had walked into slaughter again and again. Some clung to superstitions, insisting that the Americans had called on spirits or sorcery. Others guessed the truth, that science had moved faster than courage, and admitted bitterly that they had been beaten not only by strength, but by vision. In time, as the secrets began to emerge, historians pieced together the story. They saw how one device had altered the course of countless battles, how it had turned the Empire's most reliable tactic into a liability, how it had reshaped the very psychology of the Pacific War. It was the weapon of the future, one analyst wrote, a future the Japanese could never imagine, and one that remained hidden from the world for a generation. The jungle nights of 1944 and 1945 became legend among those who knew, not because of the volume of fire, nor the size of the battles, but because of the silence, because death had come invisibly, in absolute darkness, with an inevitability that no amount of bravery could resist. What had once been an ordinary ambush had instead been the attack that changed the war. And when at last the truth was revealed, it stood as a reminder. The Empire lost not only the war, but the very night itself.